Hello and welcome to a special FP virtual dialogue. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you're having a good day. I'm Ravi Agrawal, FP's editor-in-chief, and it's my pleasure to be your host for the next hour. Now, we're here today to discuss cyber and nuclear security and how to strengthen global cooperation to protect critical systems. Russia's recent seizure of a nuclear plant dramatically raised the stakes of the war in Ukraine. It highlighted concerns over vulnerabilities of nuclear facilities and the ability to defend critical infrastructure. In addition, cyber attacks have escalated sharply around the world, with countries like Iran, North Korea, and China targeting financial services, transportation systems, and communications networks. So against this backdrop, we've gathered a terrific group of experts today. We hope to discuss how the world can collaborate to mitigate risks and thwart cyber attacks from state and non-state actors. A big thanks to the Schmidt Futures, and its International Strategy Forum for helping us make this event possible. A disclosure here, I work for foreign policy, but I have a loose and unpaid association with the International Strategy Forum, where I help to mentor some of their young emerging leaders. Before we start, we want to be sure that we can hear from you, our global audience. We have thousands of people tuned in here, as well as watching our live streams on social media. I've carved out some time to take your questions. I believe in the wisdom of crowds. So write in. You can use the Q&A button on Zoom or email events@foreignpolicy.com. Tell us your name and where you're writing from. And on social media, use the hashtag critical security. Okay, let's get started. My first guest is Brandon Wales, the Executive Director of CISA. That is, of course, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Brandon, welcome. Great to see you.
Ravi, really great to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Pleasure. Thanks for the time. So let me just start with this. In the general public, we only hear about cyber attacks when they're really, really serious. And one imagines that there's a lot of smaller stuff that gets prevented. So, essentially gets caught in your fisherman's net. But just how much are you stopping? How many attacks does the government actually prevent?
So I'd point out that it's not just the government that's preventing cyber attacks. Every day, companies, government agencies, nonprofit organizations are subjected to kind of a barrage of attempted cyber compromises, cyber intrusions that are thwarted by defenses. I would say the government is trying to work collaboratively with industry to make sure that we've got better visibility in what's happening in the cyber ecosystem, and providing them information to actually enable improved security. So we believe that the work that we are doing enables that type of protection, prevents cyber attacks, and makes any compromise that do happen less severe.
Now, the Biden administration released its national cybersecurity strategy last week. How exactly does that make us more secure?
Sure. So, I mean, again, a document by itself is not going to make us more or less secure, but it's going to provide the roadmap and the framework under which we're going to operate to improve the security of the homeland and our friends and allies around the world. And I think if you look through it, the various pillars underscore the different aspects of cybersecurity that we need to take seriously to get ahead of the problem, from both protecting and defending our most critical infrastructure, taking the fight to the adversary to disrupt their operations, building international coalitions, making the cyber ecosystem more resilient by enabling improved technology that enables operations worldwide. It kind of maps out what are those essential pieces that we'll need to work hard over the next several years to fully implement and to continue to drive improvements in security at the same time that we're seeing adversaries, as you noted at the top, are becoming even more aggressive in cyberspace.
So, I mean, just for example, like what would the new strategy and changes that have been made over the last couple of years, how, for example, could agencies and the private sector collaborate, say, to stop a SolarWinds attack or a Colonial Pipeline attack? Where has infrastructure here improved?
Sure, that's a good question, and I'll kind of highlight a couple of aspects of how we're thinking about this problem. in some cases, as you'll note in the National Cyber Strategy, discusses how we want to make sure that we're fully utilizing all of the authorities the federal government has that may have been untapped to address cybersecurity challenges. So, for example, in the wake of Colonial Pipeline, the Transportation Security Administration implemented new security directives around the cybersecurity of pipeline, rail, and made changes to the cybersecurity requirements related to airports and aviation assets. Those were previously available tools at the federal government's disposal that had not been utilized to actually in place minimum cybersecurity standards on critical infrastructure. Those are now in place for the most critical pipelines and rail assets, and they're being implemented, driving security improvements there. But it's not just those kind of mandated aspects of the mission where we're making progress. About 18 months ago, CISA stood up its Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, bringing together the various federal agencies involved in cybersecurity, along with the companies most critical to the cybersecurity of the entire IT ecosystem. So we had large cloud providers, the major cybersecurity vendors, the major internet service providers, major technology companies, because these are the companies that are enabling critical infrastructure operations at tens of thousands of sites around the country, hundreds of thousands around the world. So by providing and working with them, critical infrastructure is receiving information more quickly. We've got information coming in from one party that's being shared with multiple of their peers in real time, particularly related to significant incidents, and it will allow us to get ahead of problems more quickly, ensure that if we're seeing some type of cyber activity in one place, other companies can take action immediately to protect protect their clients, protect their customers, et cetera. So we think that both on the mandatory side as well as on the operational collaboration side, we're seeing dramatic improvements over the last several years that are making us safer, making us more likely to detect and stop attacks like the SolarWinds operation a couple of years ago, prevent and disrupt operations like what we saw against Colonial Pipeline and JBS Foods and others.
I want to talk about Russia and Ukraine in a minute, but first, the strategy document we've been discussing, it described China as, quote, the broadest, most active, most persistent threat to both government and private sector networks. How so? Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think this has to do with both scale and reach and technical sophistication. So what we see from Chinese cyber actors is a very large capacity that China has devoted to their cyber operations. Deployed throughout the Chinese country, multiple parts of the Chinese government, all focused on using cyber as a means to advance Chinese aims in terms of both espionage, in terms of using it to enable coercion of foreign countries, to enable influence operations, to enable cyber effects operations against U.S. critical infrastructure and infrastructure at countries around the world. They have the largest program, and what we have seen over the past decade is a dramatic increase in technical sophistication, making it harder for us to track what they're doing, making our job more challenging, allowing them to hide within the broader flow of cyber activity that's happening online every day. And so that threat is pervasive, and it is a significant one that the United States has to work extra hard to grapple with.
I promise to take some viewer questions. We have many thousands of people watching around the world. So if you're listening in, you know how to reach us, the Q&A button on Zoom or events@foreignpolicy.com. Let me just continue on for now. Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How much has Moscow attacked Kiev's cyber infrastructure? What surprised you about the nature of those kinds of attacks in the last year?
Yeah, so we have seen over the course of the conflict, starting even before the tanks started rolling into Ukraine, Russia using cyber tools to attempt to disrupt Ukrainian critical infrastructure. Probably the largest scale, the most well-known aspect of that was their disruption of the Viasat satellite communications network that was being used by Ukraine, but also had spillover effects in multiple European countries. Other than that, there was a lot of focus inside of Ukraine, attempts to disrupt their energy, transportation, communications infrastructure. And the reality is they have not been very successful in that effort. And, I think generally attributed to two factors. One is a lot of work by the Ukrainian government to improve its cybersecurity posture since 2014, slow and steady over the past over the succeeding 8 years, enabled them to withstand a number of the Russian efforts to disrupt their critical infrastructure. A lot of that work was supported and helped by countries around the world, like the United States, like the UK, like Canada, as well as by a pretty vibrant cybersecurity community that tried to offer a lot of assistance to the Ukrainians. But it was also
and have those any sort of attacks, have they also been on U.S. infrastructure? I mean, how much are you able to stop?
Sure, we have not. I think we were preparing for potential blowback against the United States, against the homeland. CISA launched a Shields Up campaign in January of 2022, even before the invasion started, to make sure that we were prepared, recognizing that an invasion was likely, that we were getting industry ready for potential attacks here at home. We have not seen that. It doesn't mean that there's no Russian cyber activity targeting against the United States. Obviously, countries like Russia and China and Iran and others are constantly looking for weaknesses in the United States critical infrastructure and government networks, and we have to work every day to make sure that they're stopped. But we have not seen successful attacks on the United States from Russia, from the Russian government. And I think that is a credit to the work of both government and industry partnering together to make sure that those are much harder to achieve. And it has reflected in some respects decisions by the Russian government on what they're willing to do right now.
And I suppose one way of looking at that is, how much of this is American defenses being very good, or Russia's offensive abilities here not being good enough. I want to bring in a couple of questions that are coming in from our viewers around the world right now. Kerry Dunn, Nolan Metzger. Nolan's question is, we seem to be relying on deterrence and prevention. How much do we go on the offensive to disrupt foreign entities? Kerry Dunn had a similar question, disrupting attackers. How do you go about doing that? How much does that matter? The difference between trying to defend versus offense as the best defense?
Yeah, so I think this requires a balance, and I won't speak for General Nakasone, who is the commander of U.S. Cyber Command and responsible for U.S. offensive cyber operations, although he and Cyber Command have discussed operations in the past. I think it is a reflection that we need a balance between the two. Neither defense nor offense alone can kind of provide is a silver bullet to provide the level of cybersecurity that we need. And so we need to balance our defense with attempts to disrupt adversary operations, and that could mean disrupting their infrastructure, their ability to communicate, their use of tools. But in some cases, they're able to kind of get back up and running relatively quickly. If some infrastructure comes down, they will build up new infrastructure. It may cost them time, but it doesn't take them off the battlefield completely. And so that is why we need to make sure that we are coupling strong offensive action with strong defensive action. And I think in some cases there's a continuum between the two. So if offensive operators gain access to adversary networks, identify specific tools that they're using, getting those into the hands of defenders to make sure that those tools are now their defensive. Our defenses are kind of attuned to the new tools that are being used. That's the way it works every day, and the strong collaboration that exists between our teams here in CISA and the FBI and NSA and Cyber Command. We need to make sure that this is a partnership, because neither side will be completely successful without the other.
Right. Here's a question from Samuel Klinkenberg, and it's one I hadn't thought of before I sat down to do this today. What's your stance on Ukraine's mobilization of a volunteer IT army? And it raises several questions because, when private groups try to help, is it the role of governments and agencies to help them help, to deter them? Do they help more than they hurt more than they help? What's your stance?
I won't comment specifically on Ukraine's volunteer cyber army, although I will note that I think there's been some recent reporting indicating that Ukraine is trying to bring them more officially within the fold to address any legal challenges that actually exist from having this kind of volunteer army. But I would say, in general, when you want to conduct a cyber operation, you want to be really clear about the effect that you're achieving, and you want the adversary to be clear about, in many cases, what you were trying to achieve and where it came from. Having third parties out there doing that work without kind of control introduces a lot of uncertainty into that equation, and that may not be what's best for kind of broader geopolitical stability. And so I think it is a balance. It is an issue that needs to be carefully evaluated. And it's clear that Ukraine is kind of going through a further evaluation of how it uses those groups themselves.
We're almost out of time, and I know you need to go as well, Brandon, but if you could leave viewers around the world with just one final thought about how the world together can collaborate more to mitigate the risks of cyber attacks.
Yeah, so it's a really important question because we view our international partnerships with friends and allies around the world as really a key aspect of our cybersecurity here at home. We have relationships with over 200 computer emergency response teams around the world where we are sharing information on cyber activity that we're seeing. Obviously, with closer friends and allies, we share even more day to day on what's happening. That provides us early warning. It enables more collective defense, which I think is critical. And I would say every country has a role to play here. Every company has a role to play in terms of supporting the cybersecurity of the countries that they operate in. And it's something that we take very seriously in trying to build this community to be stronger, to make sure that no matter what our adversaries throw at us, we'll be able to handle it, and we'll be able to kind of get our critical infrastructure back up and running as quickly as possible.
We wish you all the best of luck with that. Brandon Wales, you are the Executive Director of CISA. Thanks for joining us. Okay, well, there's a lot there for us to chew on, and it's also a great segue into our panel conversation, where we're going to take a closer look at strategies for strengthening cybersecurity, bolstering international cooperation, and also the nuclear element, which we haven't discussed enough so far. So I'm delighted to welcome Caroline Balin. She's a research affiliate at the University of Cambridge and lead of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Future Generations within the UK Parliament. Dr. Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of CEPA, the Centre for European and Policy Analysis, and Dr. Paige Stoutland, Consultant for Scientific and Technical Affairs at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Welcome, all of you. Great to see you all. Alina, maybe I start with you. What do you think the international community currently sort of understands and doesn't understand enough about the threat landscape for nuclear vulnerabilities, for cyber vulnerabilities? Where do you come on that?
Well, thanks so much, Ravi, for the question. Really fascinating discussion we just had with Mr. Wales as well. Was listening very intently, especially to his comments that he touched on regarding international allies cooperation, which is, of course, one of the core pillars of the new U.S. cybersecurity strategy. Just a couple of 30,000 foot level thoughts to your question. First, I think we have a long ways to go to establish proper international cooperation on cyber. Looking at Europe, for example, which has introduced something that the European Union calls the Cyber Resilience Act, it doesn't necessarily always go hand in hand with how the U.S., according to our most recent strategy, thinks about cybersecurity. We don't necessarily agree on the threats, for example, even with our closest allies. we don't necessarily agree on attribution, which often enters this conversation and ends up being a hindrance a lot of times in agreement on, which cyber actors are state-sponsored or not state-sponsored. How do we address the differences between these kinds of actors? And as part of that, we often roll in to our broader conversations on cyber information influence operations, or what are called IOs. And I think there's even less clarity on how we think about the threat vectors, attribution, all of those different details. So first and foremost, I think we need to be thinking about how we can align with our most like-minded partners, and that's primarily Europe. My second comment is that there's a real opportunity, I think, to use a lot of different efforts that have already been out there. The cybersecurity strategy is one, Cyber Resilience Act in Europe is another. But in addition to that, there have been quite a few proposals, and in some cases, in some European countries, laws that have been enacted, looking at how we can secure things like data flows. I mean, the big divide has also been between the US and Europe on that, but hopefully we're going to get there soon to make sure that we can have free flowing and secure data across the Atlantic. But we have to think beyond that. We really have to think in the international level, because we are already so deeply vulnerable, as we were just hearing earlier. Cyber attacks have increased by 300% since 2020, just against Ukraine and NATO states. This is according to a recent report that Google put out. So this is just the information that one company has. But 300% increase is really significant, obviously. There's an opportunity, I think, at the G7, which of course is going to be hosted by Japan a couple of months down the road here. And Japan has really prioritized setting a set of standards at the international level so we can start to agree on what constitutes trust. Who is a trusted supplier? How do we understand issues around norm setting in the cyber domain? So I'll just leave it there. I don't want to go on, but I think the international piece and the transatlantic piece is where we need to be looking at. And we don't have alignment or agreement there at all.
Thank you, Alina. Paige, let me bring you in. You're at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, NTI. Talk to us a little bit about how over the last year, given Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you're thinking about the way in which the world is handling the potential for, nuclear material to fall into the wrong hands, for countries to misuse it, for non-state actors to misuse it. What are the threats that we are not thinking about enough?
Yeah, well, let me step back for just a second and say a couple words about what makes the cyber nuclear issue so challenging, right? And it's obvious that it's potentially incredibly high consequence events. It's not just stealing data, it's not just loss of sort of business continuity, but has a potential to have incredibly serious safety issues. The other point I'd make is that that addressing the cyber nuclear issue is at the interface of digital security and nuclear engineering. And so it's a very unique, discipline in many ways. And so the question then is, how do we address that, whether it be theft of nuclear materials or compromising the safety systems of a nuclear power plant, for example? And I think particularly given the situation in Ukraine, where, no one imagined having to defend nuclear facilities at the state, level, if you will. It's important that we start to do what I would call sort of stress checks, fail-safe reviews, if you will, so that if a nuclear facility is compromised in a cyber sense, we understand what the physical implications could be, because that's what's, I think, most concerning to us. We've been working sort of on this concept of fail-safe reviews related to cyber attacks on nuclear weapons and related systems. And in fact, while it's not the topic of this particular call, there is an ongoing fail-safe review being led by the Pentagon. And that's just incredibly important for us to understand, how could this go wrong? What are the types of scenarios that could lead to not only being compromised, but some catastrophic incident? whether that be involving nuclear weapons or even nuclear facilities. So let me stop there. I have a comment later on about how we promote international cooperation and some activities we're doing in that regard. But let me pause for now.
No, good start there. We'll come back to the idea of cooperation. I think that's a very good place for us to build towards. But Caroline, let me bring you in. Just from your vantage point, have you seen increased efforts in Europe at the EU to combat info ops, disinformation? Are you seeing increased cooperation?
That's a really good question. I'm glad you touched on that because it's such an important issue. Yes, there's absolutely renewed priority. Well, it's always been a concern, but I think the war has really made it clear what the seriousness of the issue, because for the moment, we're seeing a lot of disinformation operations levied against EU countries, specifically to try to undercut support for the war in Ukraine. So the idea is to blame rising energy prices on the war in Ukraine to try to turn the views of the population. And what concerns me the most is that anecdotally, not having actual data, but from conversations I've had with colleagues in France, it does seem like it's having some effect. And I think what's especially concerning is that these problems are just getting more and more difficult, right? First of all, we've seen Twitter and Facebook lay off a lot of their teams that were responsible for tackling disinformation online. We're also seeing advancements in AI. Everybody's talking about ChatGPT, but it's also deep fakes. It's all of these new technologies. And so the EU is putting a lot of funding and effort into this and making it a priority, but the scale of the problem is such that it needs so much work and so much effort. There's so much to be done. So
there is a lot to be done. Alina, so let's dig into that a little bit more. I know you do a lot of work in this area, also on transatlantic cooperation. What kinds of things would you recommend that policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic think about and do to cooperate more and to make that cooperation more seamless? Because essentially a lot of what we've been discussing this hour is being able to predict and respond faster than would-be attackers, would-be malactors. So you have to be sharp. How do we do that?
It's a great question. I've been working on that issue for more years than I'd like to think about, to be honest with you. I think the conversation on this particular issue has been moving, but very, very slowly. Just as a top line point, I think we do have to distinguish between what we call cyber attacks or cyber operations and information operations. Sometimes these go hand in hand, like when you have a hack and leak kind of campaign that tries to influence public opinion through stolen information, but often they do not go hand in hand. And I think the tools we have to address these two threats are pretty separate. So Caroline mentioned info ops. Here, I do think the transatlantic community woke up to this a little late. It was really, frankly, after the 2016 U.S. election that we started to care. But the threat has been there before. And of course, countries like Ukraine are very much a testing ground for threat actors, in particular Russia, but not just Russia. And we can't have a lot to learn, I think, from how Ukraine has been quite effective on the defensive side. Here, I think a specific recommendation from my mind is on the info ops, so countering disinformation. Look, here, we've tried a lot of different things. I think social media platforms have tried a lot of different things. Unfortunately, we as governments have been putting the responsibility on private industry. And of course, we see that in private industry, ownership changes, like Twitter, and this is no longer a priority, and that's that. And there's very little, actually, that governments can do to force companies to make changes because it's very expensive. It's very expensive to hire content reviewers. So I think we really need to move beyond that framework. And the way we do that is that we have to get on the offensive. We have to think about disruption. This is how we get ahead of things. It's not about
And when you say we here, just to jump in, Alina,
Mhm.
Given what you describe about the unpredictability of the private sector, if it changes hands and therefore changes priorities. So when you say the we, is this governments then and to the exclusion of the private sector?
No, absolutely not. The only way we do this is together with private sector companies, because oftentimes they're the front lines. I mean, like it or not, but oftentimes governments do not have access to the same kind of information as large companies like Google, like Microsoft, others. And that information is incredibly valuable. We've actually seen, in ways in which American companies have been very effective in working together with US governments, European governments in Ukraine. There's been a really fantastic private-public set of private-public partnerships there. So absolutely, the private sector has to be at the table. And I think we have a huge amount of work to do on trust still. When it comes to that, in this area, I think this administration actually deserves a lot of credit because they have been working with industry. They've tried to bring them to the table. But my broader point here is that, defense is not our best offense here. And we started talking about offensive capabilities in the cyber domain. We have to just switch our lens. We have to focus on disruption, on preventing versus reacting, and being more proactive, and agreeing on the attribution of threat actors, both in the info ops space and the cyber ops space, and going after these groups. I think until we do that, and we're very, very far away from that, this is going to be basically a permanent problem. And no matter how much money we throw at it, I don't think we're going to solve it.
Paige, let's riff off of that. So the private sector's role is crucial in cooperation and getting ahead of threats. Offense is, an important part of defense. But also a lot of what we've been discussing so far feels like a game of whack-a-mole where, at some point, something emerges that is too big or too strong for the defenses you've prepared. So again, given all of this, you mentioned that you want to speak more about cooperation, but how do countries cooperate? And within cooperating, are we also creating loopholes and vulnerabilities for bad actors to exploit?
Yeah. Let me give a specific example, a narrow example, but a specific one. So we did some work a few years ago on what's important for securing nuclear facilities from cyber attacks, and a number of things sort of rose to the top in terms of being important. And one of them is the actual expertise of the people at the facility. And protecting a nuclear facility is not done by just hiring a bunch of so-called cyber guys. You've got to have people who understand the nuclear engineering aspects and what could happen if indeed there was a compromise. And it turns out those people are few and far between. Now, places like the United States and the EU, I think, have some real strength in that area. But if you look at countries around the world who may have only a few nuclear facilities, they may have just a handful, of experts. So what do we do about that? Well, there are a number of existing fora. The IAEA, for example, is focused on computer security. That brings together sort of representatives of countries around the world to talk about some of this, and that's critically important. But what we found was that there was a real lack of discussions about how you actually provide the security. There was a lot of, well, what should you do? What are the regulations and so on, but very little about how do you actually go about doing that? So 3 years ago, we created an entity we call the Cyber Nuclear Forum, which brings together practitioners from around the world. These are the lead technical people at the various nuclear facilities, largely employed by utilities around the world or others that own nuclear power plants. And this group has met now, a couple times a year for the last several years. And it's been incredibly gratifying to see what goes on at these meetings. These are all practitioners who are interested in securing their facility. They're all incredibly talented, and yet they don't have a large sort of network, at their own facility to compare notes and figure out what makes sense. what sort of device should they buy to screen USB sticks? How do they deal with wireless networks at their sites? I mean, again, these are very practical things, but ultimately things that really matter. So that's a model. The current effort brings together people from, I think, 14 countries. It needs to be expanded. It doesn't include really, everybody that should be involved, but it's just been incredibly gratifying to see the sorts of discussions that happen that impact real actions. I mean, I could point to specific examples where entities in one country have procured a system that was recommended by somebody in another country. Mm-hmm. Now, there are challenges to information sharing. I don't have the time to go into that, but that's an issue. That has to be addressed. There are constraints in the nuclear business that are unique to the nuclear business. And so not to say this is easy, but creating a community that can address these issues, whether it be sort of the current status where it's sort of, how do we best go about this or that? One could even imagine sort of response teams that are formed that go in and do assessments or even respond to, a certain situation. So that kind of practical on the ground cooperation is critical, not to the exclusion of nation states cooperating, but it's a good addition, I think.
Well, I have to say it's heartening to hear some of these examples of cooperation. I want to stay with you, Paige, for just one more moment. I have quite a few questions coming in from our viewers around the world, and one of them is just relevant to what we were discussing. So I'll bring that in. It's by Chase Duncan, who asks quite specifically, to what extent does the development of advanced nuclear reactors, namely small, modular, and micro reactors, affect the cybersecurity landscape of nuclear energy?
Yeah, so we've started to consider that. The short answer is it depends. There are many different designs being considered, and one has to look at the details of those. I think in principle, given that many of these systems are more inherently safe, that's a good thing. But these measures need to be incorporated as those systems are being fully developed and fielded. So I guess overall I'm optimistic, but the specific answer would depend on the particular system we're considering.
Caroline, let me bring you back in. Again, as I was saying, it's very heartening to hear about information sharing, but how do we move beyond that phase into the execution phase of international cooperation?
Well, okay, that's a really interesting question. I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about is around what is the possibility? Well, a lot of people have been thinking about this. What is the possibility for multilateral agreements, like basically agreements not to launch cyber attacks against each other's nuclear facilities? And I mean, of course, that's something really difficult to do. There's precedent, and NTI has actually written about this. There's a treaty between India and Pakistan. It's part of this broader treaty on the limitation of nuclear arms. And as part of that, they have pledges not to attack each other's nuclear installations. And so, I mean, I think when you start talking about things like this, it seems like something so difficult to do and something so far out. And right away, you ask questions like, how are you going to be able to reach an agreement? How are you going to be able to enforce it? What about the attribution problem? All of these things. So I think that there's a lot of complexity to work out, but I think it's still important to start thinking about this, because as Paige was saying at the beginning, just the scale of the, if you were to have a release of radiation, those consequences are going to be, they're not, think about Chernobyl, it didn't just impact Ukraine, those consequences are global. So there's, I think that there's a lot of, I think that there's definitely reason. And I think one of the things I'm concerned about is it might take a really big incident in order to make that happen. So obviously in Ukraine, Russia has had a bit of a disregard for the safety of nuclear plants or
complete disregard, I would say.
Sorry?
Complete disregard.
Yeah, complete disregard. So, is it going to take a really big incident to get people to start talking about this? Because I think if you go back to the Cold War, for example, I mean, obviously I wasn't working on that, but talking to people who did, it was when things started escalating, that, they had these same problems. How are you going to verify? And it probably at the time it did seem daunting, but they did find solutions. So it's something I've been wondering about. So something to think about.
Yeah, indeed. There are just as many questions as answers here as always. Alina, let me bring you back in. If one were to imagine a bad state or non-state actor watching a discussion like this and watching, how countries, private sector, other groups are talking about organizing and better planning and going on the offense, how do you think those actors are going to react to these plans and to these sort of solutions that we're all trying to come up with?
Well, I mean, to be clear, we have to put our own security first, because as we've been discussing here, the threats are current and they're real and they're increasing. So, state-sponsored cyber operations for intelligence gathering or ransom or just generally politically motivated attacks are not going anywhere, and they're increasing exponentially. And so we're just behind already. So to my mind, that train has left the building, sort of the train of our potential adversaries already using these tools to attack critical infrastructure, to undermine our democracies in all kinds of various ways. And I think this is just us leveling the playing field, frankly, and really seeing how we can now take the fight to them, because I know that's maybe a controversial thing to say, but at the end of the day, to be honest, unless you have classified access, and even if you do, you're not going to talk about this in this open forum. We don't know exactly what the plans are, nor should we,
Sure.
In the general public. But to my mind, we are simply now playing catch up versus, getting out there and getting on the offensive against particular actors, I would say. The threat landscape, to my mind, is incredibly broad. We're not really talking about just China or just Russia, or even about state-backed actors exclusively. WannaCry, I'm going to go back to that just very quickly. I mean, that was a great example of how I think most operations and operators are now functioning, where there is a compromised set of tools and then leaked on the internet by a group we don't know very much about. This was the shadow brokers. And then those tools are used by malicious actors, our own tools in that case that we developed, supposedly. So I think that's actually where this all is already. And, WannaCry has now been quite a few years ago, and the threat landscape has moved on from that, and we're just far behind.
So I want to ask a question, and this is for any of you, so just raise your hand and I'll come to you with it. Several of our viewers have raised the question of where AI fits into this. And we, talk about so many different applications of AI, often for good, but how much of an increase in risk does it present? I mean, doesn't it turn at light speed the current cyber protection systems? Doesn't it make them obsolete in a sense? Any of you want to take that on? Okay, Paige, go for it.
Well, people may not like this answer, but I think it's too early to tell. I think it can be used in the defensive way, it can be used in an offensive way, and how that evolves, I'm sure lots of people have opinions, but I think it's too early to tell. I will say, again, in the nuclear area, it's not just about the cyber element. It's about what sort of physical change you can affect. And there are specific things you can do to reduce what could happen in the physical space. Someone asked a question about, new nuclear plant designs. There are things you could engineer in, so no matter how compromised you are, it would not lead to a safety incident. And so I think those are the types of things, trying to reduce the risk of an actual physical effect that will be somewhat independent of how effective AI is or is not in the future.
Just to add something quite quick. I think most people, I've been working on AI for a few years now, and what's kind of struck me is how many people in corporations just don't realize that AI is hackable in a number of different ways. Like, it's surprising that people don't realize this, but there's a lot of different ways to hack AI systems. So I think that's a real concern. I mean, the other thing I'd wonder about, maybe it's kind of a question for Paige. So in an old paper that Paige wrote a long time ago, he talked about he's got a good quote about how we're building systems that are too complex for us to understand, or something like that, when he was talking about nuclear facilities. And that's my concern, is when you add the AI, you've already added so much complexity, and then you're just adding a lot more that could go wrong.
We are indeed. Paige, you want to riff on that?
Well, yeah, let me just give credit where credit is due for that statement. So that statement that we've built systems more complex than we can manage actually was made by a speech by a guy named Dan Geer, who was actually referring to our financial systems. And I think it's true. We have made systems now more complex than we can effectively manage, which, particularly for high consequence systems, whether that be a nuclear weapon, whether that be a nuclear facility, or even the country's financial systems, that's an incredibly dangerous place to be. But that's where we are.
Let's spend a beat on the private sector. Alina, maybe I'll come to you with this. There's a question that's come in about popular hostility to big tech companies, whether that hobbles the ability of these companies to operate in the area of cybersecurity. And I've also been wondering about how, as big companies essentially become, in some senses, as powerful as states. I mean, they're net states of sorts, and not just American or European ones, but global ones. And we're going to see bigger, powerful tech companies come out of India and Nigeria and other African countries. And that, of course, then can be used in a million different ways. There are a lot of questions embedded in this, of course, but how do you think about the risk reward kind of ratio on the private sector's role in securing the world against cyber attacks and cyber threats?
That's a great question. And, to go back to how you started, I mean, frankly, I don't think our politics have been helpful, to say the least. And in fact, deeply counterproductive if our goal is security at the end of the day. And, I will say that in Europe, that security lens is not usually there when regulation is being crafted or thought about, whether that's in the recent Cyber Resilience Act or the AI Act that's currently being discussed in Europe. In fact, often we see that that's the big wedge between Europe, the United States and Europe, is that here we like to think about national security when we're thinking about issues related to AI, issues related to cyber, export controls, the whole slew of tech-related issues. And that's really not the way a lot of Europeans, especially not the European Union, think about these issues. So I think there, in Europe in particular, this narrative that quote unquote big tech is the greatest enemy of all I think has led to some very problematic policies, frankly, that have actually exposed and introduced new security vulnerabilities. I don't want to get too much into the weeds of this, but this has been pretty well documented in various reports. And I think the problem there, honestly, is that we really need to think about our technology companies in the United States and the West as an asset. They're a huge global asset because exactly of the reason you pointed out to Ravi. These are companies that may have emerged in the United States, but at the end of the day, they're global operators. And think about how many people in the world use WhatsApp or use Gmail, right? The reason why a company like Google is able to stop so many and track so many cyber threats is because so many people use Gmail platforms, and governments don't have real access into that. But we have to start working together, and we have to change the narrative that technology is somehow inherently evil, or these tech companies, because they've gone too big, are somehow counter and undermining democratic values and principles. It's just simply not true. It's just the narrative we've developed. And I think if we continue down this path, governments can't do it all. They just can't at the end of the day. And so we have to work across the public-private divide. I think that is, again, where we really need to be going.
It's so true. You mentioned WhatsApp, for example. It has far more users in, say, India or even Indonesia than it does in any Western country, barring America, I guess, in the case of Indonesia. So there you go. I mean, these companies may be American, but they are essentially global in their scope.
And sorry, Ravi, may I add just one last thing? I'm sorry to go out on this, but I think we haven't really even thought about what is going to be when WhatsApp is replaced by, let's say, a Chinese company, just like we're now seeing with TikTok, right? And the answer to a company like TikTok is not let's ban TikTok. The answer to that is we need to have an international set of standards that are based in democratic values and principles. And then we can assess security threats and trust based on those standards, not let's ban a single company. That's really not going to do anything, frankly, except make people upset. But I think we haven't quite grasped the reality in which millions and millions of Americans are on a platform sharing all of their data, all their information, and all of that data is accessible by the Chinese government. And that's because we've had no initiative in this country from the Congress in particular to do much about it. So I think this is really where we need to be thinking about. Would we rather have, our kids on a company that at least tries to work with the government, is asking for regulatory guidelines, versus one that is completely basically unregulated, and on top of that provides access to a country's government that we have identified as a real potential security threat to the United States. So just putting that idea out there.
Yeah, it's so true. And we need a broader framework to think about these things, not a case-by-case basis. We're almost out of time. Paige, why don't I try to get you to give us one big takeaway for policymakers specifically who are watching this discussion? We're foreign policy, so I imagine there are, many people in government around the world, in various countries, who are watching this and looking for lessons. If there's one thing you want them to walk away with, in terms of an actionable thing they can think about or work on, what would that be?
Yeah. So I would say that people need to understand that the cybersecurity problem will not be solved technically. There is no way to provide 100% security of any system, no matter how important it is. And what that implies is that the solution to better security is not only technical, it involves procedural issues and, importantly, policy issues. And so those who are in the policy community need to start thinking about what set of tools they have, how they might be able to reduce the risk, and not just leave it to the technical people, although those people are incredibly important.
That's a great takeaway to leave people with. Dr. Paige Stoutland, Alina Polyakova, Caroline Balin, thank you to the three of you for joining us. I learned a lot.
Thanks so much, Ravi.
Our pleasure.
Great to have all of you on. Okay, time for some closing thoughts. It is my pleasure to bring in now Andrew Moore. He is the Chief of Staff at Schmidt Futures, and to Eric Schmidt himself. Andrew, welcome. You've got a very interesting piece out in Foreign Policy this week. I'm going to shelve that for just 1 minute because I want to discuss the substance of that. But before we go there, just tell us a little bit about Schmidt Futures and the International Strategy Forum.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ravi, and to the foreign policy team and the exceptional guests we've had, Brandon, Alina, Paige, Caroline. I learned a lot here. I think what you were speaking about is a lot of what the International Strategy Forum hopes to achieve. So the Strategy Forum was begun in 2020 by Eric Schmidt, Fareed Zakaria, and Jared Cohen, trying to be a way to bring together people from both foreign policy communities, but also technology and scientific communities. And we've been able to do that over the last few years, bringing together a variety of fellows and scaling the program internationally, such that we now have really two distinguishing features compared to a variety of the other programs you'll see. First, it's for 25 to 35-year-olds focused on trying to bring together an interdisciplinary group that really gives people a chance to hopefully work together for 30 years of their careers. And the second piece is the global nature of it. A lot of programs focus on just the United States or North America, but we have cohorts in Asia and Africa. We just had a conference last week in the Middle East. And so it's a great opportunity to really do things like what we did today, as we were saying. I mean, we've been protecting nuclear facilities since the creation of nuclear facilities in the 40s, but thinking about all of the new ways that the cyber domain is going to bring challenge and threat to that is something that's exactly at kind of the intersection of technology and foreign policy.
And I have to just point out, I mean, I think I've spent a bit of time with some of the young ISF fellows, just amazing people from around the world, inspiring, smart, all young future emerging leaders we should keep an eye on, but also hope that they collaborate among their groups. Just very quick for anyone watching, if someone wants to get involved with the group or apply, how does one do that?
Yeah, so actually, I think we're lucky enough to have the foreign policy team hopefully send out a little application for anyone who's interested and eligible. And then you can also go to isf.schmidtfutures.com to learn more.
All right, excellent. Urge everyone to do that. It's a fantastic program. And I say this as someone who is not paid to do so, just because I've seen many of the fellows and I think they're all amazing. So Andrew, before I get to your piece, quick sort of thoughts on the discussion we've had so far. What's your, and again, for people who may not know, Andrew spent a long career in diplomacy before he began working for Schmidt Futures. So Andrew, given what we've heard so far, what's your sense of, the major gaps that exist in global cooperation on these issues of cyber risk, cyber nuclear risk, and how we're thinking about it?
Yeah, the collaboration piece is going to be critical in the years ahead here. It's one of those things where it's always difficult because of the way technology evolves to be ahead of it as regulators. And Europe oftentimes takes a leading role in that. But it's really critical that we come together and think about real ways to be able to work on things. So the TikTok example, just to take one at the end of Lena's discussion, is a great one. It's going to be a critical one here in the United States, and then to think about ways in which we can work on bringing together other countries to not just have it as the United States banning this or something like that. I mean, you look at examples like India that have had TikTok bans already. I think you'll see, in the days ahead, a variety of ways in which hopefully we can work together on things. To take one specific example, just yesterday, TikTok came out in an effort to try to stop itself from being banned in the United States, to talk about even more of the new ways in which they're going to be able to police themselves. And you'll see Xu, the CEO, come testify in front of Congress. And one of the things that they're trying to do is to make sure that they label generative-based AI elements. So if something is modified or changed and not a real image, that they would be able to say that somewhere as like a watermark on one of their postings. I think that kind of stuff is going to be critical for all social media down the road. And so something that we can learn from different examples and ideally try to roll out with some consistency across the board.
So, we were discussing AI as well earlier in this discussion, and some of that was centered around the risks. And, our consensus, I think, is the jury's out on what we can do about that. But you actually had a fairly positive piece that, was very thought-provoking, how AI can revolutionize diplomacy. So just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this stems from my time working on Secretary Kerry's team from 2014 to 2016. And then subsequently from that, I immediately went out to Silicon Valley and had the opportunity to do things like work at Google X and see all of the new things that were being brought about, from the ill-fated Google Glass to some of the AI work that's going on. And it's quite clear, as everyone's seeing already, I think it was just reported yesterday that some of the embassies are using AI and Bard, which was just released, and ChatGPT to draft rudimentary cables and things like that, especially in the unclassified world. I think there's going to be a lot of things like that we'll see over time, but it's kind of fun to think a little bit about the ways that diplomacy will change. Obviously, you mentioned some of the risks, but being able to interact with someone without an interpreter, I think, is going to be a very useful thing that just allows many more conversations than you would have otherwise. Some of the other technologies that kind of go beyond just simply AI, the United States occasionally has to send money to various entities overseas that sometimes might be sanctioned or something, as in the example of the Iran discussions that I referenced in the piece. And being able to use blockchain to do that sorts of things is a pretty significant change to what we were doing in terms of just stacks of cash in the good old days. And so I think you'll see a variety of ways in which diplomacy will begin to adapt some of the new technologies. AI being first and foremost, as I mentioned, already writing briefing papers and things like that in a rudimentary way. I think it's going to just get better and better.
Fascinating. Well, you've heard the 60-second version. Go read the piece. It's on foreignpolicy.com. An excellent one from Andrew Moore. Andrew, real pleasure to have you on. Great to see you.
Thanks so much.
All right. And a big thanks again to Schmidt Futures and its International Strategy Forum for supporting this event. To all our speakers and our viewers around the world, thank you again for joining us. Thank you to the speakers for sharing their perspectives on how governments and organizations can collaborate to safeguard critical infrastructure against cyber attacks. As you all know, hybrid warfare and the cyber threat landscape is a complex and important topic. You will continue to see Foreign Policy cover that in a variety of ways. Our events do not stop. We hope you will join us for our 3rd annual Climate Summit, which will take place in Washington, D.C. and virtually on April 26th. Stay tuned for updates from us. Find out much more about the lineup and other upcoming events at foreignpolicy.com/events. I'm Ravi Agrawal, FP's editor-in-chief. Take care and see you soon.